Hello, Veronique.
Hello, Suchandra.
Thank you so much for being here with us today for Chung Hung Institute podcast. I am so fascinated with you. You're a medical doctor, studied psychotherapist, and now you work with chronic illness and trauma. Tell us a little about yourself. Who are you?
Oh my. The chronic illness piece was my own story with my own diving into chronic fatigue. Is what it ended up getting named as, but it became disabling fatigue, where at my worst, I was mostly in bed for about 9 months and had trouble doing any of the basic activities of daily living. I'd have to rest after taking a shower. I could drive if I went somewhere, but I'd have to rest and wait laying down for appointments, that kind of thing. And I, it made me very curious. This happened while I was a doctor, it started, but I thought it was just stress related, which is a very common perspective in medicine, that symptoms are often linked to stress. And I'd finished my residency and I'd been working as a teacher in a residency training program for a few years, and my work hours were really long and very stressful. And so when I left, I thought my health would improve, and it didn't. It actually got worse. I took a year off and my health got worse. And I was still able to go to school and retrain and do a master's program while this was happening. And it kept getting worse. And I learned about trauma when I was at Naropa in this psychotherapy program. And that ended up being the path that captured my curiosity. And so that's kind of where you probably found me, this whole link, the trauma and chronic illness link.
And Naropa.
And Naropa, did you go to Naropa?
I did go to Naropa also.
Oh, what did
I
you
think
study there?
also counseling, clinical counseling.
Yes.
Yes. Veronique, you know what's been really interesting is in the United States, we see chronic inflammation off the charts many years, right? We see heart disease being the leading cause of death since before 1950s. I couldn't even continue my research because it just keeps going back and back. We took a 1 year break in 2020 where COVID was number one, nothing to celebrate. But uh, it's just so crazy. Over 75 years, we have chronic heart disease, number one illness that's killing people in America. Number two is cancer. You know, I feel like everywhere I go, I meet at least one person who has cancer. And I mean, I know there's a lot of generational wounds. Um, and I just wonder, what's the link here with trauma? It has to be a link here with trauma, right?
The 8 or 9 of the top 10 causes of death, mortality, chronic disease in the US have links in the research to trauma. So, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's and dementia, those are in there. Kidney disease, cancer that you've mentioned, all kinds of cancers. When you look at the research in different types of trauma, they both or many of them link. So, for example, the adverse childhood experiences, the ACE studies that a lot of people have heard of, the 10 specific types of trauma before 18 years of age that include abuse and neglect, um, violence in the household. Those are associated with 8 of those 10 top causes of death. And then I developed a term based on the ACEs. I call them adverse babyhood experiences, and those are based on other bodies of research. I didn't do the research, but I pulled together what other people have been studying for 50 or 60 or 70 years also. For adversity up until a third birthday that isn't addressed in the ACEs. So prenatal stress is one of those. And prenatal stress, there's a whole body of research known as the developmental origins of Adult Health and Disease, DOAD. DOAD and prenatal stress comes from original studies were in World War II, a hunger siege where this whole communities were kept under siege. And they studied afterwards what the outcomes were for women who were pregnant during that siege. And they found higher rates of heart disease in their babies that grew up for the women who were pregnant during that time. And their initial thoughts were it was from nutritional stress and starvation. And that has continued to show up in the literature. But they also began to realize being starved and under siege in a world war is traumatic also. And so the emotional component is also something that they've been researching and are still doing now. And those are risk factors for inflammation and for insulin resistance. Diseases of insulin resistance include diabetes and the metabolic syndrome and high blood pressure and heart disease and Alzheimer's. And so the research is really deep and broad about this.
So how can someone know if they even have ABEs?
That's a really great question. Because it's like the ACEs, it's not, and what we know about trauma, it's not that everyone who experiences an accident, for example, has the effects of it being traumatic. For some people, it's just a stressful thing. They were resourced, they were supported. Maybe they're a race car driver who had a whole bunch of training and it wasn't a big deal. And for someone else, it was. Same thing with ABEs. So that I've put ABEs into 10 categories of risk as opposed to 10 specific types of trauma. And I have more details on my website and more details on an ABES fact sheet. And I could always send that to you if people want to be able to download it from your website. But in general, it's things like the parent's trauma in general, the mother's trauma in particular. When we have our own unresolved trauma, we know this from multi-generational trauma research that it can get passed down epigenetically. The prenatal stress component, there's if a mother has an experience of physical illness during pregnancy, that's really stressful for the mother and the family, and therefore also very likely for the baby as well. So if a mom has preeclampsia or has really worrisome bleeding during pregnancy, for example, or has high blood pressure, those could be risk factors for increased stress for her and for an impact on the baby.
Mhm.
And it's not the mother's fault. It's like the big thing about trauma is that it's no one's fault. These are things that happen outside of our control, and that's part of what makes things traumatic.
Yeah.
So people wondering can look at, were there events during their own prenatal experience? Were they born premature? Were they in an incubator? Were they in the neonatal intensive care unit, for example? And being born small, so typically the research suggests under 7 pounds, the smaller we are, the more that's an indicator of potentially having experienced prenatal stress. Premature birth can be an indication of prenatal stress as well. So people who had those kinds of overt experiences may have had, I would call those ABEs, and those may have been risk factors if they're having health problems now.
Yeah. I love so much how you say that when we have trauma, it's like it's nobody's fault. Because I
Mm-mm.
think all of us have trauma, all of us have wounds. And it's so easy to say, oh, it's because I did this or I did that,
Yes.
or the other way around, it's because of you that I'm traumatized.
Yes. Yes. And that's a tricky one too, because a child growing up in a family system with parents who are traumatized, who express their trauma that's unresolved by maybe being violent, by maybe being abusive emotionally, by maybe being neglectful emotionally.
Yeah.
There's a place where feeling our actual feelings about that, which could involve a phase where we go through blame because at least we're not taking on 100% of it as being our fault for not having been good enough, for not having done the right things, or not having pleased our parents, whatever it may be. There's a place in the healing journey where feeling the grief, feeling the terror or the fear, or feeling the rage is actually part of mobilizing out of what many of us end up feeling, which is a state of relative freeze or numbness or not having feelings or not even realizing that it's okay and that people have feelings. A lot of times people grow up with parents that aren't emotionally connected because of their own trauma, and they don't even realize, they think, oh, we just ignore feelings. That's normal.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Carol Truman. Do you know her book, Feelings Buried Alive Never Die?
No.
It's phenomenal. She lists a bunch of ailments, a bunch of diseases, um, and just even symptoms. And she's like, because of these experiences, these feelings, I think it was like cancer, different cancer, certain ones are due to suppressed anger in the heart, right?
Yeah. The suppressed anger is actually more important than a lot of people realize, including medically trained professionals. And I've seen this, and I share this in a podcast with a woman who has rheumatoid arthritis. And when she worked with the trauma by beginning to notice what was happening in her body, to be curious about it, to not blame her body also. She noticed that when she had pain and flare-ups in her wrists, that when she tracked where that sensation originated, it was anger.
Yeah.
And that had this impulse of wanting to punch a hole in the wall.
Mm.
And ultimately, in her own childhood, I think it was her father who had a lot of rage, and it wasn't safe to express anger, let alone feel anger. And this is really common for a lot of people who have experienced trauma, is it wasn't safe to have those feelings, or there was no one to go to. So trapped rage is actually a part of coming out of the effects of trauma, coming out of freeze and coming through and back into life. We don't want to get stuck there. That's what another effect of trauma is. If we have these violent impulses that we can't control, then that's also a trauma response. But being able to feel those and move through those to come out the other side, that's part of a journey of healing the trauma.
So when people come to you, Veronique, and they're saying, I cannot get rid of this headache, or I can't get rid of the shoulder pain, back pain, whatever it is, what do you do?
Get really curious. And I get
More.
curious with them. What's that?
Say more.
Say more. Yeah. So in my training as a somatic therapist, I went to Naropa and I discovered the program because I was curious. How do we talk to the body? How do we listen to the body? And so, if you can get curious, that's already beginning to differentiate and separate yourself a little bit, at least, from 100% belief that it's true, 100% state of often, like if pain's really severe. I had low back pain for 6 years. I had trouble walking. I had trouble standing. Um, Pain can be really scary. The pain itself can be really scary. The idea that you might be stuck with it forever can be really scary. And for many of us, whatever symptoms we have, it often is not at a 10 all the time, every day, every moment. And so we can get curious about that. Is there a moment where it's a 9.9 or a 9.5 or anything else? That could be a place to start. Um, Anything that invites curiosity makes more space. and often something that leads to pain or chronic illness or chronic symptoms, whether it's mental health symptoms like depression or anxiety or rage. When we think about it from a trauma context, getting curious gives us the room to see what might be triggering it, to see where it might come from. And so you can be curious about that. What triggered this migraine? What triggered this low back pain? What triggered this whole belly bloating, unable to digest thing? Did something specific trigger it? So that's another place you can be curious.
Yeah. We see a lot of people who say, oh, it's the food I ate, or it's this activity, or it's this person I spoke to. That's the culprit there, right?
Mhm.
How do we work beyond these kind of views? Because sometimes it is the food,
Yes,
and other times,
absolutely. Yes, I had food intolerances that got worse, progressively worse over a period of 10 years. And at the end of that, at its worst, I couldn't tolerate anything. I couldn't tolerate vegetables. I couldn't tolerate fruit. I had long ago had to stop all carbs, bread, desserts. These things would lead to all kinds of symptoms that were so intensely uncomfortable that it really makes you look for another way through, right? When you're really sitting in a lot of discomfort. So sometimes we have to start with the physical. So I changed my diet. It took that long for me to make drastic changes and really eliminate things. I went on the GAPS diet. That was what resonated with my system. I then had to do something more severe because things still got worse for me that way, but it bought me some time. So for 4.5 years on this really extremely limited way of eating, it really decreased my symptoms. And that gave me more headspace, more heart space, more capacity to keep doing trauma work, as one example. When you catch the trigger, and let's say it's somebody, you've just had a conversation with someone, and then you have a flare up of your lupus or the pain that you normally have, whatever the symptom is, the being curious part can make you wonder what happened in that conversation. So you can take it away from it being about that person. That's another step of differentiating and not just going to believing 100% that the experience was true in every way. And true might not be the right word, but real, maybe. Um, Often when you look through, you might see that that person may have said something that was triggering for you. Maybe there was an element that it triggered shame in yourself. Maybe you felt like you weren't good enough or you didn't try hard enough. Or maybe that person said something that actually had an edge to it. Maybe there was some blame directed at you. Maybe you have guilt. And so teasing that apart to see what it is. I had a conversation with a friend once, and it took me 10 days of a really big flare up in my fatigue. And I kept wondering what the trigger was, and it took me 10 days, and I finally realized it was that phone call. And my friend had just been talking about um, somebody's birth that she had gone to, and there had been some difficulties in that birth, and there had been a chance that there might have been a really difficult outcome, like somebody might have gotten hurt. And that was my trigger. And so even that was a big surprise. Triggers tend to surprise us when we start to try to pull it apart and see what's under there. And in my own history, there are some pre and perinatal things. They go back to my father, who almost died in his birth. That may be in my system. In my own system, there were a number of events that led to sort of a break in the bonding process, an interruption. And so those can be how we start to look for links to trauma and links to trauma that can happen in relationship. And often when it's with another person, it links to how our childhood experiences and relationships were with the adults who were our primary caregivers, whether it was our parents or somebody else. And so that's how we begin to trace and go back and realize how long things can go back, how far they can go back.
You've kind of alluded to this. The only way out is through. I don't know who
Mm.
said that,
Mm.
but that quote always stuck to me. So, how did you get through your fatigue, your own work? I mean, you're so energetic. The moment we started the Zoom call, and it's Veronique.
Ah,
So, how?
Suchandra! I am still working through it. I have come to, I'd say, acknowledge and accept, most of the time I accept it, that this is probably a lifelong process. That what led to my own health conditions happened over at least my own 18 years of growing up, but also in both generations on both sides of the family system. There's chronic fatigue in actually both sides of my family, disabling chronic fatigue. And moving through it for me has been giving it a context. So, from a trauma perspective, when I think about fatigue, a level of exhaustion where you wake up in the morning and you do not feel rested, where getting out of bed and getting vertical, as I think about it, actually takes some effort. You don't just bound out of bed. I don't just bound out of bed. And folks with fatigue, a lot of chronic illnesses have fatigue. From a trauma perspective, fatigue is actually a state of freeze that is covering over what my hand underneath. I have a top hand that's flat out here that represents freeze, and underneath it, I have a fist that may represent fight or flight that wasn't allowed or couldn't happen. Like this person who had the rheumatoid arthritis and discovered that in her wrist pain was anger, but she couldn't express it or feel it as a kid. So realizing that there's often a lot of energy underneath a freeze state. And the more energy there is and the more tired you are, the stronger it is suggests that that freeze state is holding back stuff. And so for me, it's been a slow process of beginning to feel what's underneath that. And it's very sneaky. You don't feel it for a reason. Like I grew up not really that aware of my emotions. Um, and so through therapy, which is really supportive for a lot of people, doing actual therapy means being in a relationship with someone who is trained and skillful enough to really be present in a way that helps hold the process in a way that's safer than what we've experienced before, and that can often help us find that sense of safe enough to then begin to feel things like the grief, like the terror, like the rage, and then to see what they want to do.
Yeah. It sounds like once you accept, you embrace, only then it can transform.
That's a good question, actually. Let me just think about that for a moment. I don't know that that's actually true. For example, you make me think of a podcast I just did with Tony Madrid. He's a psychologist in California who works with mothers whose kids have asthma.
Mm.
And he was seeing this one pair that were referred to him at one point, and this mother had gone with her daughter to see all kinds of people. They'd been in therapy, and the daughter finally started hitting the mother, and that's when the therapist said, this is way over my head. And they went to Tony, and Tony's exploration is what happened at birth. He's looking to see, was there something that interrupted the natural bonding impulse that we all have? Again, not through anyone's fault, not through the mother's fault. So he asked the mother, and she said, well, I was in jail at the time that my daughter was born, and they gave my daughter to my mother. And so my mother, the baby's grandmother, raised my daughter for the next, I don't know, I think it was 6 months until I got out of jail and I got clean and sober. So that's a really big disruption to have 6 months of separation and to be unable to be with your baby because of being in jail, for example. So in that case, they're sitting in the office waiting for him to come to them, and they're bickering and yelling and angry at each other in the waiting room. And they are not accepting of anything. They don't even know that trauma's a risk factor here. Nothing else has worked. So Tony worked with the mother in this very short approach that he's developed. Again, no blame. He helped her repair the things that were happening around that birth. And when they came in for the next follow-up, like a week or two later, he went into the waiting room and the daughter was laying across her mother's lap.
Mhm,
Mother was petting, like
mhm.
stroking daughter's hair, like they were best friends. So, in that sense, I don't know that you have to accept it first. You do, I think, have to have enough curiosity or enough willingness to look into it or go see someone who might help you with it. At that level, you need that. But I don't even know if you have to accept it first. I think the acceptance is a process, and you probably know about that yourself in your own work.
Yeah, I wonder, even going to therapy, though, doesn't that take some level of acceptance? Because if one is in denial, they won't even see a professional.
I think you're right about that. So maybe it's some level of acceptance or some level of I want to do something differently than
Yeah,
what I've been doing before.
yeah. So when people are going through these trauma cycles, going through them, experiencing and maybe even being a participant in verbal or emotional abuse, right? Unconsciously, again, due to trauma. Yet we're in a world that is not going to be like, oh, Veronique, you're being really mean to me. It must be just trauma. Like that would be great if we were in that world.
Yeah,
But are there any practices that can kind of help people come to a realization of the cycles they're in? Any contemplative practices so we can address the roots, not just see, here's the symptom. Like what does that look like?
I think it can look like many, many things. I think one first one would be how do we be kind to ourselves? And how do we be kind to ourselves enough that we can imagine that we didn't do this on purpose or that it's not our fault? Or that maybe there's some other way of making sense of this. Or maybe there's someone trustworthy enough, just enough that they might be able to help me. Or maybe I remember my therapist, when I first started seeing someone, I was in medicine, my fatigue was starting, I had low back pain, and it was starting to impact my how I was supervising, for example. I would supervise for the afternoon. I would lay on the floor with my legs up on the chair and I would talk looking up to the resident and talk with him that way. But I had to do that because of the back pain. And one day, it's really easy to get angry at our bodies and to get angry at the symptoms and to, I mean, it stimulates naturally so often desperation and despair. So it's really common for us to get really angry with our bodies that are failing us. Really feels like our bodies are failing us or trying to screw things up for us and for our lives or for our work or for whatever we're trying to do. If we can find kindness, kindness is part of that piece of curiosity. But if, like, okay, the therapist told me that day, he said, what if your lower back is doing the best that it can? That was kind of a mind-blowing change of perspective for me. And as physicians, I mean, we treat our bodies like cars. Okay, it just needs an oil change, or we just have to replace this part, or if we just put this band-aid on it, and bodies aren't like that. So the kindness piece also involves another example, if we think about this practice, this exercise, if you or your body were a child, how might you treat that child? So let's say it's your chronic illness, or let's say it's you and you imagine you with the chronic illness being a child. and that child is in pain right now, and that child is really scared and also really angry, what would you do with that child? How would you treat that child? And so that's another way that we can sometimes access or guess at how to even consider being kind with ourselves. And often this will stem again from the kind of relationships we had in childhood where we did not experience that kind of kindness or support or someone that was trustworthy that we could actually soften into and have our grief or those tears with. So thinking about the child can often make it also easier to be kind. It's like, wow, I might actually invite that child to climb into my lap and maybe I would just hold them
Mm.
and let them cry and tell them it's okay if they're sad or angry.
I remember there's one instructor said to me before that she couldn't love herself. And what she did was she locked herself in a room. Now, I'm not telling anyone listening to this to lock themselves in a room, but what she did was she locked herself in a room and she had a mirror there. And she said, I will not leave this room until I see myself with the same love my mother saw me. And she said that that was some of the most profound healing she experienced.
Wow, exactly. And there's a certain level of acceptance there and a certain level of determination and a certain awareness. Oh, I don't love myself. Once we can identify something like that, then how do we work with it? And
Yeah.
that could be something that works for more than one person. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So we've
Mhm.
spoken about the person who's experiencing the trauma, who's experiencing the pain, right? What about the ones who are taking care of those people? I remember at one point I was doing some work at a neuroscience clinic, and we were seeing people who had traumatic brain injuries, TBIs. Most of them were in beautiful relationships in the beginning. So beautiful marriages, family life, but then the TBI progressed, and the caretaker or even the partner was no longer able to sustain the kindness.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
So the role of caregiver, and I'm going to include parents in that. Um, I'm actually having goosebumps right now. And grief.
Yeah.
My mother's going through memory decline right now. I haven't talked about this anywhere public yet, because it's still new and it brings up a lot of feelings when we're caregiving, caretaking, being with someone.
Yeah.
And when we're in that role that has that level, that's maybe the one who has more responsibility or more capacity, it asks a lot. And it can ask you to be more regulated, more available, more willing to do things you wouldn't normally do otherwise. It asks a lot. And when there's a strong bond of love with that person, that makes it easier. That's part of what we understand the bond, the parent-infant bond to actually be about, is it makes it easier to tolerate the sleepless nights and the challenges. But as adults, we have to include ourselves in the equation.
Yeah.
We're not selfless, all giving all the time. We can't actually do that without something happening for us, something difficult or painful or having fallout for us. And so for parents and other caregivers, we actually have to take care of ourselves also.
Mm.
And this is where the oxygen mask in the airplane, where you have to put it on yourself first Because if you don't have your oxygen mask, you're not going to be of any use to anyone if you're not alive, right?
Yeah.
So it's a path of how do you find your own boundaries and what your own needs are so you include yourself in the equation. So
Yeah.
that could look like listening to where your system is, and it may be that you hit a wall at some point, and that wall is that you can't do this for one more second. In which case, it may be how do you find support? Maybe someone else can take over so you can take a break. Maybe you need to set a boundary and say, no, I can't actually do this component of your care. I've I've done it too much, or I've done it enough, or this is too much for me. And so part of self-care involves listening to ourselves and our bodies. Sometimes we don't realize it, and it's our body that tells us, like the hitting the wall, and giving ourselves permission to set boundaries and say no.
Yeah.
That's part of how we think about that. Does that begin to answer a little bit of that huge question?
Yes, I think that's a whole podcast episode in itself.
Yeah, I think so too.
So, last question for you. What's the work that needs to be done in the field now? What do you want to see for the scientists listening, for the researchers? Where's the gap?
I don't think we're talking to each other enough. In medicine, for example, almost every chronic disease that I've looked into to see, has anyone done research to see if trauma is a risk factor? Almost every chronic illness has somebody who's done research in that particular specific chronic illness to say that most of the time it's a very clear yes, especially now that we have the ACE studies. But people are still so isolated in their silos that the people who study rheumatoid arthritis are not talking to the people who are working with folks with migraines, or not talking to the people who are studying type 1 diabetes, or not talking to the people who are studying chronic fatigue. And so it's the whole elephant thing. Someone's looking at the toenails, someone's looking at the tail. They're all kind of blind, and they're all seeing different things, and they're all, I think we're a little caught up in thinking that what causes chronic illness is the enzyme that's missing, or the genetic predisposition that's there, or the protein that's not working right.
Yeah.
The more we can understand about trauma, the more we can train medical and health professionals about the very well recognized and acknowledged and well studied physiology, the physical, physiological, biological components. And then this next layer, the psychotherapy, the trauma therapy component that understands how. This is a long answer, your last question. Um,
Perfect.
you what?
I said perfect.
Oh, good. Um, there's the medical, physical, physiological component of trauma that I think medicine can really get and understand and stand behind, because that's what the medical model understands, the physical world. But how do we combine that with the psychotherapy perspectives of trauma therapists who really see how this is a survival mechanism that's actually driving the protein to do what it's doing? It's actually driving the epigenetics to turn genes on or off. It's actually driving whether our guts are absorbing or not. It's actually a survival response that's driving the inflammation sequence. And to think of this as survival responses or cell danger responses that have gotten activated. And then how do we think about it from that perspective?
Yeah. I hope someone hearing this can actually do that.
I know. I think we've got islands of people that are talking to each other and crossing platforms and crossing domains and specialties. And that in a moment of optimism here, I could say that these little islands are just going to continue to grow,
Yeah.
because so many of us are discovering this ourselves, and many of us who are in the work, who are using these tools for our own individual health and also the people that we are working with or helping or caregiving with. And so there's a whole brand of people, a whole tribe of people that are having direct experiences of how this makes sense of things and how it helps.
Yeah. Oh, please let the islands turn into continents.
That's right. Yeah.
Veronique, if people want to find you, they love your talk, how can they do so?
My blog is called chronicillnesstraumastudies.com.
Mm,
And you can contact me there. You can find fact sheets for free to download, free ebooks. It's all on my blog.
great. Thank you so much for being with us here and being vulnerable. Also, being daring enough to be yourself.
Thanks for having me, Suchandra. Thanks for your great questions.
Thank you.